with a falsehood, you're faced with two options. You can accept it or you can reject it. The basis upon which we take one of these actions is a product of our critical thinking capabilities and a desire to know what is true instead of confirming our bias. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. On Brainstorm, we choose the hard truths over the comforting lies. Reason, compassion, skepticism. This is the Brainstorm Podcast.
Hey folks, welcome to the Brainstorm Podcast Skeptic Studio, the interview show from Brainstorm, where we talk to a variety of folks with the intent to spread critical thinking, compassion, and skepticism. It's been a couple weeks since I actually worked on this stuff, so I'm a little bit out of practice, I guess. I want to apologize for the lateness of the episode. It's 2 days late, at least, by the time you'll get this. I know that it probably doesn't affect anybody's lives, but I feel a responsibility to have my episodes out when I say they'll be out. And I feel bad that I couldn't get it out early for patrons. And I feel bad that it's 2 days late for regular listeners. Like I say, probably doesn't matter to anybody but me. But I feel like I was irresponsible in getting it out late. I have no good excuses, just I was on holidays, I was sick for a little bit, but not enough to make it make sense of the lateness of the episode. I just procrastinated because I was on holidays. But I'm back to work now, and my schedule's back to normal, so a couple more weeks and everybody in my house will be back to school. So I'll have my regular times to work on things. There will be some changes to the show in the future, but I'll discuss that when the time comes. So, this week's guest is Jason Noblit. Jason runs the Facebook page Dictatorship of the Swoletariat. And I've been Facebook friends with Jason for a while now, and every now and then we message about stuff that's going on, and he'll share articles with me about protests and protests against Nazis, and he'll share some criticisms of Jordan Peterson with me. And in that time, I've been also looking at social justice and looking at social issues. And I've noticed that a lot of the criticisms of society and culture that affect social justice end up in discussions of exploitation, colonialism, and as a result, they also lead to criticisms of capitalism. So I've reached out to a couple other people for further discussions on the subject of socialism, because socialism and criticisms of capitalism are all wrapped together quite a bit. So I should have good discussions and explanations of socialism to come. But this this chat was an awesome primer on the subject, and I think it gives you a good background as to what socialism is, some of the ideas behind socialism, and some of the rebuttals to arguments against socialism. So with that, I guess here's my interview with Jason Noblit. I hope you enjoy it. All right. Welcome to the Brainstorm Skeptic Studio. Today I'm talking to Jason Noblit. Is that right?
It's close enough. It's pronounced Noblit. It's French.
It's French.
And my name is misspelled, but it got Americanized to IT, but it's supposed to be Jason Noblit. But
okay,
thank you for having me on, Cory. And
you bet. We've been talking back and forth a bit for a while now.
Yeah,
you're a big fitness guy. I used to go to the gym regularly.
I feel you there.
But and recently we've been talking a lot about kind of just socialism and like social issues. So I guess one of the things that I've discovered in my recent shows is that capitalism, criticisms of capitalism come up all the time. Like it's almost like you can't talk about socialism or social issues without criticizing capitalism on some level.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, when people think about socialism, what is socialism versus what people think of it?
Okay, so this is probably one of the most controversial things in all of left-wing politics, but essentially the most accepted definition of socialism is workers-owned means of production, meaning that the workers own it. And I have actually seen written from Vladimir Lenin, the ownership of the means of production must be democratically owned, meaning that the workers get to vote on how the ownership is. But this gets very, as far as like what people think socialism is, it ranges everywhere from the government owns literally everything to a welfare state like the Nordic countries. And of course, like roads, public roads. And yes, no, roads are not socialist. They are publicly funded, but they are not socialist.
Right. Yeah. So, what about something like welfare? Is that a socialist program?
I would say no. Like welfare in of itself, in my opinion, is actually a product of capitalism. I am having a little bit of a brain fart thinking of who came up for it, but it was I believe it was a Kaiser of Germany.
Okay.
But he created the first welfare state.
Okay.
And the idea behind the welfare state was that it would give the poor and the have-nots basically enough to keep calm and not cause a revolt and prevent more radical, more left-wing politics from actually shaking up the system or having a revolution. So, no, I would not consider welfare to be socialist.
That strikes me as some of the criticisms I've heard about the universal basic income idea, is that it's kind of just it's the capitalist answer to the poor, basically, or automation.
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. And one of the things you must take into this is right-wing parties are actually some of the people that are pushing universal basic income. Like Milton Friedman talked about it. And in Finland, I believe they had the trial with it. It was the center-right party that offered it, not one of the left-wing parties.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in Ontario, they tried it, a very small program with it, and it was the Liberal Party that tried it, which is our centrist party in Canada.
Well, that's what it should be. Only in America do we think of liberal as left-wing.
Yeah, that's right.
That's another term that's fun because especially in the internet leftist circles, people like to use liberal as an insult, which I personally am not a fan of.
Right.
But
it's I guess in modern political talk, it gets leftist and liberal is almost interchangeable by some people, but then by other people, it's not
and they get offended by if you for example, I know multiple people that consider themselves liberal and they're probably social democrats and probably would even be open to true socialism.
Right.
But if you go, oh, liberals are horrible, blah blah blah, it's they would get offended and you would actually push them away. And then there's also the opposite where liberals think they are genuinely leftists and they're genuinely fighting against the left to maintain a capitalist system.
Right.
And they don't understand that.
That strikes me as something like the neoliberal type thinking. They often do consider themselves on the left, but they're also very pro-capital in a way. That's even
when I think neoliberal, I think Milton Friedman.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting the different ways that things can be defined and the way people look at it.
Terminology sucks, to be honest. It's better to actually have a clue what you're talking about. Before we get too far off topic on this, but think about how people have we've seen the term socialist become normal and almost accepted. But if you say communist,
right, that's
now we're into something. It's historically, it's not really all that different, but
right. So I guess what is the difference, say, between social Democrats and socialists?
Okay, so social democracy and social democrats have like a really long history, and there's been periods of time where they've been closer together than now. Now they seem to be a bit more apart. But normally what we think of as a social democrat is historically someone that thinks that we can, through reformism, vote in and eventually reform society to a socialist government.
Okay.
Now, in modern society, social democrat is more so someone who thinks that we should build up a big welfare state, put high taxes on capitalist corporations, and essentially capitalism with a friendly face. We provide universal health care, we provide free college, free education, and all these social programs, but we maintain private property rights and we don't disrupt the actual capitalist system. Where with socialism, and more specifically revolutionary socialism, historically a socialist or a communist would want to overthrow the bourgeois state and establish a proletarian state or a dictatorship of the proletariat, if we were using Marxist terms.
Okay.
And start socialism that way. And socialism wants, like we discussed earlier, workers' own means of production, democratic ownership of the means of production.
So I guess just to drill down a little bit, what does it mean to say that the workers own the means of production?
Well, essentially, like in a capitalist system, we have a capitalist in, for example, the one capitalist or his family or something own the entire factory.
Right.
In a socialist system, the factory would be owned by the workers in total, kind of like a co-op.
Okay.
Like, and the way we would work it is the workers would vote for elections on their management. And that way they could vote on who manages the company and how the company is run. That way it will be run in the interest of the total of the workers at the factory, not just a few elites at the top that own the property.
Okay. So in a way, like management would have to appeal to everybody who works in a factory rather than appealing to the bottom line of the boss.
Yeah, shareholders or the boss. Yeah, essentially that. Like, if a factory got to vote on whether to ship the factory overseas, we know which way that's going. But when it's the shareholders or the boss who owns the place, it's probably getting shipped overseas if it's more profitable.
Right, right. So how does that compare to the concept of unions?
Well, unions have a very strong history in socialism, and historically many unions have been socialist. If you know the International Workers of the World, several of the founding members, including Eugene V. Debs, were self-proclaimed socialist. And what they used that was basically bargaining power to be able to say, it's like, hey, if you're not going to give us enough pay or safe working conditions or whatever, we're going to strike or we're going to do this to oppose your business, and it's not going to be profitable for you. And it's where sayings such as divided we beg, united we bargain, or something like that. I probably got that wrong, but stuff like that. That's where that comes from. And like they've actually very, very much so had a long, long history with socialist causes.
Okay, so unions and socialism are linked in some very close ways.
Compatible.
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
Very much compatible.
I've often identified myself as an anarcho-syndicalist, which struck me as like a type of a libertarian socialism, like almost like...
Oh, very much so. I mean, syndicalism, I almost think of just like a bunch of co-ops.
Right,
the workers would control everything, and the difference is you don't have the state, and that's one of the differences between anarchist theory and Marxist theory. Is Marx wants a dictatorship of the proletariat, and anarchists want to abolish the state first. And I mean, we could get into the history of the split of the Communist Party and all that, but that's probably a little boring.
Yeah, we'll see how the rest of the hour goes. So I guess we kind of covered the basics of what socialism is and what we are talking about when we discuss it. But what are some of the, like, I know in the America, it's often socialism is just like misunderstood. It's just blah. It's a bad word. Like, So what can we describe socialism as to people who already have that negative perspective in a way that they'll actually understand what it means?
So this is something I've actually done almost just kind of as a fun thing with people I know, or sometimes a waiter or waitress at a restaurant bar, is instead of saying socialism or this, what I'll do is I'll ask them this. Hypothetically, if the boss didn't show up to the restaurant, but all the workers showed up, would the restaurant still run perfectly okay? And most people say yes.
Right.
Because, the workers do the overwhelming majority of the work. The boss just kind of watches over.
Yeah.
And then I ask them, if none of the workers showed up, but just the boss showed up, would the restaurant function at all? And obviously it wouldn't.
Right.
It just wouldn't be feasible. So what I propose is that the boss would be the least useful of this. What would be a more effective idea is the workers would get to vote on who their manager is.
Okay.
And then the surplus value, which is extracted from the total expenses of the restaurant, would then be distributed to all the workers, opposed to just the boss making the profits.
Right.
And normally, everyone up to this point is just eating out of my hand, because this makes perfect sense.
Right.
And then I ask them, do you know what this system is called? And they don't know. And I tell them, that's communism. When I tell them it's communism, there's normally a little bit of taken aback.
Right.
And then I've never had someone that hears me say, oh, that's communism, and think, well, that sounds horrible. Normally they're pretty open to it after that point. So that's actually getting back to the labels thing, where labels suck. It's
Right.
where ideas sometimes are better. And I think that's a good strategy.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. Describe the actual idea, and then, yeah, that way they're dealing with they have to compare the idea of what they thought it meant to what they now know.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. So, we kind of mentioned that Marx thought the, proletariat should be a dictatorship over, so, a lot of people are going to balk at kind of the idea of a dictatorship. So what is something that you can say that, or what are your thoughts about the concept of a dictatorship in Marxist terms?
Well, this is actually a very interesting thing, because dictatorship of the proletariat is a very scary word to Americans, because when we think of dictatorship, we think of repressive and horrible regimes that kill off people or have horrible human rights abuses.
Right.
The term dictatorship historically has not actually always meant that.
Okay.
And what Marx meant by dictatorship was a total ruling by the working class. So it would be a democracy that gives full power to the working class. And what Marx would actually say about our current society is we live under a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie.
Okay.
And
interesting.
Bourgeoisie being capitalist, for anyone listening that doesn't know those Marxist lingos. Sometimes but essentially what he would and when we look at it, there's a brilliant video on YouTube that's called Corruption is Legal in America. And it basically explains how corporate lobbying has completely taken control of our democracy. And our democracy is completely controlled by capitalists. Another recent situation with Seattle was going to put a corporate tax that would fund basically funding homeless programs.
Okay.
To help out with the homeless problem. But Amazon threw a fit because they didn't want to get taxes and threatened to pull all their stuff out of Seattle. And the city caved and decided not to tax Amazon. So when we actually look at it, somebody like Jeff Bezos has more power than millions of individual people.
Right, right.
So what Marx would state is we live under a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. A dictator of the proletariat would take that power from a small amount of people, the property owners, and he would give it to the overwhelming majority of people, being the working class, the proletariat.
So it's not a dictatorship in the way that people think of dictatorships.
And it's not. And if we want to get it, we probably shouldn't get into it too much, but like the term dictatorship has almost lost meaning in itself. It's become to mean a word for country government that we don't like, that America doesn't like. So, for example, it's like, how many times do you hear Cuba being called a dictatorship compared to how many times you hear Saudi Arabia called a dictatorship? And I can tell you which one's more repressive. It's not Cuba.
Right. It's almost like the term dictatorship gets applied to countries that are poorer.
I would say poor in the U.S. government doesn't like them.
Right.
I think it really has to do with that. And there's several good books on this. One of them would be, I forget the author, but Naomi Klein cited it in her book, The Shock Doctrine. It's called Overthrow.
Okay.
And it basically states how whenever there's an overthrow of a foreign government, the first thing that happens is the government creates an economic policy which doesn't fit American corporations. Then there's a propaganda campaign that tries to tell the American people that this country is a threat to our safety and all this stuff. And then that justifies the military intervention. And you know what? We actually have tons and tons of examples of this. We have the Chilean overthrow of the Salvador Allende government, where we installed a fascist dictator in Augusto Pinochet. We have multiple ones in Central America. We tried and failed in Cuba. We overthrew the Iranian government in 1953, and we tried in Vietnam and failed as well.
Right. Something that a lot of people bring up, like human rights violations by socialist or communist countries as an argument against socialism or communism. And how do you respond to that kind of idea?
Well, the first thing I would state is nothing necessarily about any of those human rights violations is an inherent feature of socialism or even the governments there's nothing inherent about socialism about that.
Right.
If, say, let's just use it because this is the guy who most people think of, Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin apparently committed several human rights violations. There's no denying it.
Right.
But those were the policies and actions of Joseph Stalin. We do not look at, say, Augusto Pinochet and say those were the actions of capitalism. But when Joseph Stalin executes people, that's communism.
Right.
So it's very much an ideological bias. And we look at any bad thing that happens in communism or socialism and say communism did that. Anything bad that happens in capitalism, we take in the nuance and we say, no, it was this individual.
Right.
This is why it happened. And it's basically just people being biased and not understanding that even in communist countries, there's necessary nuance to understand why bad things happened, and we should be better about that. And also, let's not forget, the United States has a human rights record that is absolutely abysmal. It's just that we don't like to mention ours.
Yeah, I saw a video in a Facebook group that I was in, talking about something like capitalism or socialism killed X number of millions of people.
Yes.
And I thought, well, I mean, did communism kill those people? How many people have technically died because of exploitation under capitalism? It seems like I don't want to play the whataboutism game, but it seems like a false kind of balance.
I mean, whataboutism, like all logical fallacies, there's sometimes where it's almost excusable because you have to.
Right.
But there's a book called The Black Book of Communism, and it accuses communism of having killed 100 million people, and it commits this basic lie. And also it uses literally the highest estimates of all it. For example, what it requires is the highest estimate of the Great Famine in China under Mao Zedong, and it requires the highest estimates of those that died under Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. And the reality is like, I've studied both of those enough to know that the highest estimates of both of those are just completely false.
Right.
And there's also people died, but it was nowhere near as many as they claimed in this. And there's also some really dubious ones. I believe it counts several of the Nazi casualties in World War II as deaths by communism. And I just don't feel bad about dead Nazis. I'm sorry.
Does that fall under the Nazis were socialists because they called their party the National Socialist Party?
I wouldn't say that's that specific one, but we should probably talk about the Nazis were socialists argument. Well, the Nazis, when we actually look at their economic policies, were closer to libertarians than they were anyone else. They were just libertarians with an authoritarian government behind it because they privatized previously state-owned industries.
Right.
They cut taxes on rich capitalists. They broke up unions. Wages in Nazi Germany fell for the working class. And profits, were hitting great numbers under the Nazi system. The only thing that was socialist about them was the name. And
yeah.
And it's sadly a trick that's been working for ever since the Second World War.
Yeah, it's still something that a person sees pretty regularly, even when talking to actual white nationalists and stuff. Yeah,
and unfortunately, to be fair, some of the Nazis and the neo-Nazis, they've always appropriated leftist rhetoric. They've used terms like bourgeoisie and stuff like that, but bourgeoisie to them means Jews. And they use some of these terms, and what it was meant to do was confuse people in the working class in Germany of that day to think this was a working class party when it was really the racist Nazi party. And something else that's interesting, speaking of the Nazis, they had very strong support by many major capitalists in Western Europe and the United States.
Right.
Many of the libertarian thinkers loved fascism. They saw fascism as a great counter to the Soviet Bolshevism. And also Henry Ford was essentially a Nazi. We don't know this, but Henry Ford was very sympathetic to the Nazi cause. He was a blatant anti-Semite, and he basically had factories in Germany. And I'm pretty sure he actually sued the American government for bombing his factory in Germany and won. And he won.
Really?
Yeah, he won the lawsuit.
That's wild.
Yeah, well, a lot of the Nazi war machine was funded by capitalists from America and other Western European countries. And it's if I know Royal Shell was involved, Ford was involved, and a few others. If these companies would have just basically said, screw you guys, we're not supporting the Nazis, Nazi Germany would have fell before Operation Barbarossa or any of that ever started. But they were in it for profits. They really didn't care about the human cost.
Right. Wow. So what are some of the other kind of arguments that you've heard against socialism? Well,
one of the most popular ones is, and this is another funny one because it's really easy to debunk, is that socialism is for lazy people that don't want to work. It's for the people that want to sit on their couch and eat potato chips and then create money. And the thing that's wonderful about this is it's exactly the complete opposite.
Right.
Socialism is very, very much about workers working, and the only thing that you get is from what you work. Everyone that's capable of working works. Marx's saying, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, essentially states that you should work to your capable ability and you should take what you need. And so for example, a healthy person will work pretty darn hard.
Right.
They'll take what they need. a disabled person won't have to work much at all and will take what they need. But like, for example, in a capitalist society, we have many capitalists that actually don't do much work at all.
Right.
They make all their money through just owning property. And so the reality is what these capitalists have done is they've turned it on its head and stated that they're protecting their own lazy system.
Right.
By calling the socialist lazy. And it's like, Vladimir Lenin even has a quote where he says, "He who shall not work also shall not eat." And it's like, so the entire idea of socialist being lazy and not working is just completely the opposite of the actual ideology.
Right. What do you think? A lot of people that I've seen, when they talk about or present ideas about communism or socialism, they present it in like a grayscale video, and it's like all drab and black and white, and like there's no art or there's no luxury. So what do you think of that? Like, I mean, it seems to me that there's a lack of luxury isn't necessarily a lack of like well-being.
Yeah, I would say a lot of that comes down to the idea that capitalism provides creativity and all this stuff, which I can actually get into an argument that capitalism actually stifles creativity far more than it creates. But like, a lot of it comes down to just perceptions of how to live. And when we're looking at actually existing socialist countries like the former Soviet Union, Cuba, Maoist China, and the other Eastern Bloc countries, many of these countries were really poor compared to the United States or, say, Great Britain.
Right.
And what they'll do is they'll compare, Americans have cars, Americans have stereos, Americans have TVs, Americans have all these gadgets, and say, look how wonderful it is. And then the socialist country, they meet basic needs. They have a house over their head, they have food to eat and all this stuff, but they don't have nearly as many luxuries. And what I would argue is two things going on there. One, there's a cultural difference to where, because of different factors, people value things differently. In a capitalist society, we have what's called commodity fetishism, and we feel we have to have as many commodities as possible to feel happy. And on the other hand, the reality is these socialist countries were poor compared to the United States. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, this isn't as much a factor of socialism, it's that they were extremely poor before they became socialist, and they needed that time to develop as countries themselves. I mean, when these countries, like, for example, when the Soviet Union had its revolution, it was semi-feudal.
Right.
Like, it was extremely poor, way behind Western Europe and the United States in development. It didn't have its industrial revolution until the 1930s.
Okay.
They had that so, I mean, they actually grew, and Soviet Union actually grew pretty darn fast under a socialist command economy.
So, just thinking, like, I was thinking about Cuba, and and I always, when I would engage people about the subject, I often thought, like, well, Cuba was kind of left behind because of a bunch of like trade sanctions and stuff. Like,
yes,
so,
the embargo.
Yeah, so I mean, it wasn't necessarily the government that caused, or the economic system of socialism that caused them to be a poor country. It's that nobody, like, major countries weren't trading with them.
And that's actually a great one to mention, because if you Google human development index and then you go to the regional ones, Cuba is 9th in all of North America.
Oh.
Which is pretty darn good. There's a lot, especially when we get into the Central American Caribbean countries, there's a ton of countries.
Right.
So being the only socialist country in North America, it's actually not doing so bad. For example, Mexico is 10th.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure that the only countries in South America that are better than Cuba are Argentina and Chile. So, like, Cuba's Human Development Index is, and I don't think we should judge the Human Development Index as an all-encompassing thing of how successful a country is, But according to this one specific index, Cuba has better living conditions than the overwhelming majority of North and South American countries.
Wow. So not as bad as it's portrayed kind of in the media.
No, not nearly as bad. And that's going back to what we were talking about. It's like countries that have government or economic systems which don't fit the Washington consensus get talked about as being much worse than countries that do. And a really good example right now, because this is the hot topic in conservative news, is Venezuela.
Right.
But we don't hear about the massive strikes in Brazil over their austerity measures. We don't hear about Colombia, which has had horrible right-wing policies going on. We don't hear about these other countries that have equally as bad issues, but we do hear about Venezuela because they have a socialist government and Nicolas Maduro is a dictator. And it's like, if he's a dictator, so are all these other guys. And yeah,
right.
it's more ideological than it is factual.
It's interesting. I mean, it wasn't that long ago I considered myself a pretty staunch, I guess maybe now 10 years or so ago, a pretty staunch capitalist. And we used to really speak of socialist countries as though like dictatorship was just the norm for them. Like that was just the way it was. Socialism equaled dictator. So
yes. Or a communist dictator.
Yeah. So I guess, what is the difference between socialism and communism?
Okay, so this is actually this is another controversial thing because, for example, sometimes you'll hear somebody say the Soviet Union wasn't real communism.
Right.
And then the right-wingers will just throw a fit over that. When technically they're correct, because here's the difference between socialism and communism. Socialism is a historical stage of development, and so is communism. These are two separate stages in what in Marxist theory is called historical materialism. And it basically starts with primitive communism, which is like early indigenous hunter-gatherers and stuff like that. Feudalism. Then we get to capitalism. Then after capitalism, we have socialism, which after the overthrow of capitalism, we have socialism.
Okay.
And after with socialism, the state still exists. The workers have seized ownership of the means of production. And in communism, the state withers away and money ceases to exist. We have people who can live by the motto of from each according to his ability to each according to his need. So, for example, when someone says that the Soviet Union wasn't communist, what they're meaning is the Soviet Union never reached the stage of communism.
Right.
The Soviet Union for itself, it identified, I think it's, but it identified as a socialist country, not a communist country. Now, there's the Communist Party,
right?
But calling your party the Communist Party is not the same thing as saying we're a communist country and we've reached this stage of communism.
Right. So a few times during this chat, you've used the word overthrow. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, in the context of switching from a capitalist society to a socialist society, what is overthrow? What would that what would that entail, do you think?
It essentially would necessitate some form of revolution. And these terms, like, we sometimes carry them out to, like, unnecessary conclusions, because revolution really just means a major change in the political economic system of the society. So a revolution, like what we think is like the Bolshevik Revolution, where they stormed the Winter Palace and ran the provisional government out and took over the country. Now, or the Cuban Revolution, where there's literally a military conflict and they took over the state that way. But that's not necessarily what it means.
Okay.
I don't think it necessarily means voting in Bernie Sanders as president and Bernie Sanders changes the economy to socialist.
Right.
What it would mean is that something happens and what the current political economic system as it is today comes to an end and a new political economic system comes out of that. Now, this could be completely peaceful. It could be through violent uprising.
Right.
Or it could be something very much in between this. And it could actually, we could actually technically, I guess, vote somebody in and do away with the established political economic system and bring in a socialist system, but that's not what most people think. But it doesn't mean we have to storm Washington.
Right. Yeah, I think that most people assume revolution means like violent uprising and like gulags and guillotines. That's what that's what's coming.
Yeah, like the French Revolution.
Right.
Which I wouldn't rule stuff like that out of the bag. And that's actually one of the funny things when something like the French Revolution happened. A lot of people today that oppose, for example, Black Lives Matter, would have been siding with the monarchs and saying, "Oh no, this is horrible." And this reality is like when we look back at history, the French Revolution is mostly seen as a good thing to most people.
Right, right. Yeah, it's only after the fact that people can sort of see it as that way.
Yes, and it's the same with the civil rights movement. In fact, you could almost consider the civil rights movement like a mini revolution of sorts because it essentially ended Jim Crow type laws and stuff like that.
Right.
And gave marginalized people more rights. And that would be a major change, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. It's maybe, like you say, not a change in economic system, but in the way society ran.
Like the social views of the society.
Yep.
And another factor about that, we can't forget it. The civil rights movement, everyone loves to bring up Martin Luther King and his peaceful marches. We don't ever bring up the riots.
Right, right.
Like the Long Hot Summer, there were over 100 riots. We have to understand, unfortunately, what seems to get change is when something radical or extreme forces society to change.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I'm with everybody on this. I want this change to happen by us all coming to a peaceful conclusion and agreeing that this is the best for society. But virtually all of history completely disagrees with this thing happening
right.
this way. And it probably says somebody's going to be fighting.
Yeah, yeah. There's going to be riots in a sense.
Yeah, essentially there will be. And also, let's be honest, it's not like the status quo doesn't use violence to enforce maintaining society. The police make you not commit crimes at the threat of violence.
Right.
Our military does things through the threat and use of violence. It's not like people look at violence in very poor ways. They accept it from authority figures such as the police, the military, the government, but they look at it badly from powerless people. Look at how many Americans view Palestinian violence opposed to Israeli violence.
Right, right.
They'll say the Palestinians are terrorists, but they'll justify the Israelis, and it's just a double standard of how they view violence.
So I guess one of the notes that I had before we started was to talk about Puerto Rico.
Yes, Puerto Rico. Well, I might as well mention it. I recently read a book. It's called The Battle for Paradise.
Okay.
By Naomi Klein. And she discusses it and if you're familiar with Naomi Klein, she wrote a book a long time ago called The Shock Doctrine. And essentially what the shock doctrine is a major catastrophic event. And in the case of Puerto Rico, that was the hurricane comes in. And this justifies a mass privatization of just businesses, social programs, and everything else in Puerto Rico. And the human cost of these privatizations has been disastrous in most cases.
Right.
And with Puerto Rico, we have a very interesting case because they have historically been victims of colonialism and imperialism. And Puerto Rico, in my opinion, especially after this hurricane, is one of the best examples of Lenin's definition of imperialism, which he stated in his work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And what's going on there is wealthy elites are wanting to turn Puerto Rico basically into a libertarian paradise. They are looking at the disaster,
right,
and using it as a platform for a blank slate to go in and privatize things. And they're encouraging people with basically making it a tax haven where they get super low taxes and say, run your business here, export your goods to North America, Europe, or whatever. So what's going to happen is social programs like public schools are going to be privatized. Healthcare is going to be further privatized. The energy systems are going to be privatized and all this stuff, which is going to hurt the poor Puerto Ricans, but it's going to be super beneficial for a wealthy elite, which are mostly going to be Americans and Western Europeans, not actually Puerto Rican people. And yeah, it's not fun. And unfortunately, most of America doesn't even realize Puerto Rico is part of America, so they're an afterthought.
Yeah, I think actually I remember watching an episode of John Oliver's Last Week Tonight, where he talked about some of the tax haven stuff that was going on in Puerto Rico. And yeah, it seemed pretty clear that, I mean, they're actually exporting their economic wealth in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that would essentially be Lenin's definition of imperialism, is that the rich capitalist countries in current society, that's the United States and Western Europe, would extract the wealth of the poor developing countries, which in this specific instance, Puerto Rico, but it's also South America, Africa, Asia.
Right.
And then bring it to their countries, and our countries would live perfectly well off while the poor developing countries suffer. And it's exactly what happened. And one of the great points that Naomi Klein makes in her book is this. The farming in Puerto Rico is mostly like large-scale farming of like one or two cash crops.
Okay.
And they're not food self-sufficient. 85% of the food in Puerto Rico, I believe, is what she stated, has to be imported.
Oh, wow.
And what we should really be thinking is like, why can't Puerto Rico be self-sufficient for its people first instead of exporting all the crops they grow? And this is actually something that's very interesting. And not to get too far off topic, but this is true for Africa. This is true for South America and many other countries. There's another book. It's called 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism by Ha-Joon Chang.
Okay.
And what he mentions is developing countries actually had faster growing economies before the IMF and the World Bank came in and forced them to take liberal free market policies. And these countries were running on everything from a nationalistic economy to a Marxist-Leninist economy. And the difference was the countries were producing for domestic consumption opposed to export.
Okay. Lots to think about.
Yeah.
Something like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about Chile. Because the sound engineer for our regular show, Dave, is of Chilean descent.
Mm-hmm.
And he often talks about how they had actually, as a society, voted in a socialist government before America interfered and instilled a fascist dictator. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if what kind of, do you have some background that you can give me on that?
Yes. I mean, I'm no historian, but like I have actually read about this quite a bit, and Naomi Klein covers it in her book, The Shock Doctrine. It's actually one of the main stories she tells.
Okay.
But essentially what happened was Salvador Allende, who was a Marxist, won the election for presidency.
Right.
And what happened is when he won the presidency, America basically flipped out. I forget whether it was Nixon or Henry Kissinger, but one of them basically stated that they wanted to make their economy suffer because they didn't think they should be allowed to vote in a communist.
Really?
And the CIA was heavily in on this.
Jeez.
The CIA essentially went down there and they paid truckers not to drive their trucks. So there was they created a trucker strike by paying the truckers more than their wages and telling them don't drive. They managed to convince, of course, Augusto Pinochet to get on their side. And also, there was actual, rich capitalists within Chile who were hoarding food and other things like that to cause economic instability. But, most of this was man-made economic instability. It wasn't from the policies of Salvador Allende. But after this happened, that's when Augusto Pinochet, who the CIA had convinced that Salvador Allende would turn Chile into a Stalinist terror, he leads a military coup, kills Allende, kills anyone that was sympathetic to the Allende government, and essentially turned them into a fascist free market hellhole.
Right.
And he turned the Olympic Stadium into basically an execution site. And yeah, it wasn't pretty. He completely ruined the economy too. Milton Friedman trained group of economists called the Chicago Boys.
Okay.
And I think the poverty rate under Allende, I'd have to look it up to give you specific numbers. This is fully off memory, was 17%.
Okay.
At the worst under Pinochet, it was 49% poverty.
Right.
And completely ruined the economy for Chile. And eventually, he even fired the Chicago Boys, Pinochet did, and reinstituted some of the social policies to pretty much avoid. But it's a very interesting thing because both Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek were very praiseworthy of Pinochet. And the reason is that he saved them from communism. And this was very much a coup d'etat that was led by the American government. I mean, Nixon and I believe it was Henry Kissinger were heavily involved with this. And it's shaped Chilean politics ever since. I mean, yeah, it's not very cool.
No, that doesn't sound very cool. Wow.
No, not at all.
Yeah, I think Dave said that his dad actually fled Chile during the transition of power to Pinochet. So,
I mean, yeah, there's definitely a lot of refugees that left. Pinochet was as evil as Hitler. He just never had the power Hitler had.
Right.
It was very, very bad. Of course, this happened throughout South America. I can't give you specifics of the names of the people, but this happened in Argentina. We did overthrow a social democratic president in Brazil and instituted a military dictatorship. We did it in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala. Batista, who Fidel Castro overthrew, was one of these guys. I think we helped him. I think we helped Batista get control in Cuba. And then, of course, Castro led the revolution with his brother and Che Guevara and overthrew him.
Right. I seem to recall years ago hearing a right-wing radio host talk about Che Guevara as almost like the way he painted the picture was like this Hitler-like murderer who killed women and children and whatnot in his overthrowing of the Cuban government. But
yeah, they really like to try to drag Che's name through the mud. And the reality is Che was a complex character. Not everything he did was good. But
right.
If we weigh the scales, he probably comes out on the good side. And a lot of the things the right wing likes to harp on a few things. They like to say he was racist.
Okay.
Because in the motorcycle diaries, which he wrote when he rode his motorcycle up and down South America, he said a few racist things about black people.
Okay.
And they were racist. But at the same time, when he was fighting in the Cuban Revolution, he actually saw himself most sympathetic to the black Cubans because he saw them, they were getting the worst of the oppression. They were living in the worst conditions of all the Cuban people, and it was the white Cubans that were living well off. And also he went to Africa and fought alongside Africans. It seems that he changed on that one. The other thing they say is that he killed people, which he obviously did kill people. He was a guerrilla warrior, and he fought a war. Now, the women and children thing, I think, is completely false.
Okay.
There's a picture on the internet showing a guy from behind holding a gun at two women, and that's actually, I believe, a right wing group in El Salvador. It is not Che Guevara, but that's where that comes from usually. And the other thing they talk about is the revolutionary executions right after the revolution, because they did kill a lot of people. And John Lee Anderson's biography of Che Guevara, what John Lee Anderson stated was this, and this seems to be the consensus opinion of most historians, that most of the people that were executed probably committed the crimes that they were convicted of committing. They attempted to hold them trials, but due to the fact that Che and the other people involved were not legal experts, they probably weren't the best trials. But like the opinion is the overwhelming majority of these people were probably war criminals from Batista's military.
Oh, okay.
So, in a perfect world, they would have had super fair trials. They would have been able to have lawyers to defend themselves and all this stuff like that. And maybe we don't have death penalty at all. They just serve prison sentences or something, but we don't live in a perfect world.
Right. Yeah. It sounds like there's a lot of misinformation going on.
I'm actually surprised we haven't talked about it. The Red Scare and McCarthyism.
Oh yeah,
which is coming back in new forms.
Right.
I'm sure you're aware of a lot of the way we view Russia and China actually probably has to do with that. Not to say that Russia and China are necessarily always good or always bad. There's necessary nuance, but
right.
We tend to look at them as this scary enemy of abroad, which has a lot of old Red Scare tactics, even though Russia is definitely not communist anymore. And some people question China's communist credentials now as well.
Yeah, something a friend of mine once said is that it's not actually like that some of these countries, like China isn't necessarily communist so much as like the state is the largest capitalist.
That's an interesting one, and it's a very controversial one.
Okay.
And it's something that splits the left because obviously, like, under Mao Zedong, I would consider Mao Zedong's China to have been communist.
Okay.
And after the Dengist reforms, they allowed capitalism to come in. But what happened there is the Communist Party maintained full control over a lot of things. What I would say is this, and this is trying to be as fair as possible to both sides, is they quite clearly are a different economic system than the system under Mao Zedong or the Soviet model.
Right.
But they also are quite clearly a different system from Western capitalism. Because, for example, in modern China, the Communist Party is still in control, and they claim that their goal is to strive for communism. What their claim is they needed to make some of these reforms, these capitalist reforms, to build up necessary material conditions to later transition to a truly socialist economy and then communism.
Okay.
And I would say that's fair because when we look at their economy, they still release 5-year plans, which the 5-year plan comes straightly from the Soviet model. The biggest companies in China are state-owned enterprises, and the government has very strong and strict control over the private institutions that do exist. Now, obviously, there's flaws in their system, and I'm not endorsing their system necessarily in any way. It's not condemning it either.
Right.
But it's complicated. It's definitely not Western capitalism, but it's also definitely not Soviet socialism.
Yes. So it's somewhere in the middle there. Somewhere in between.
Yes, or something completely. I mean, the official name of their system is Socialism with Chinese Characteristics.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Very specific.
Yes.
No, that's great. I guess we're coming up on the hour. It's been a really, really cool talk. Is there anything that we touched on that I guess that you think is really important and we should get into this particular interview?
I would say the most important thing would be just trying to build up a class consciousness among the working class and those of us that are among the have-nots. Because it seems a lot of us have completely forgotten this idea, and we're more taken into other issues. And one of the things, and I'm going to use an example that Fred Hampton used, Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party. One day we need to talk about the Black Panther Party because they were a Marxist-Leninist organization. But what he stated is that the bourgeoisie uses identity politics to divide us. And he has a speech, it's on YouTube, he goes, well, I'm white and I hate blacks. I'm black and I hate whites. I'm Puerto Rican and I hate Chinese people. I'm Chinese and I hate hillbillies. And what he states is this: we're not going to fight racism with racism. We're going to fight racism with solidarity. And we expand this further. It's like, are women oppressed in our society? Of course they are.
Right.
Are LGBT people oppressed in a society? Of course they are. Are minority religions suppressed in our society? Of course they are. But the one thing that the majority of us have in common is that we're not rich, wealthy capitalists. Most of us have to work for a living. We are among the have-nots.
Right.
So what we can do is we can put ourselves together in solidarity, and we can push out the capitalist bourgeoisie and create a society that's more fair and just. Now, don't get me wrong. We can't forget about the individual struggles of the LGBT or women or people of color.
Right.
But the most effective way of fighting that, in my opinion, would be class solidarity. And just because we should mention it, this is something that holds true for the civil rights movement historically in history. I mean, Malcolm X mentioned many socialist things. Martin Luther King also may have been a socialist. The Black Panthers were genuinely Marxist-Leninist communists.
Right.
And it goes on.
It seems, like I said, kind of at the start, is that the more social issues that I discuss, the more it seems like we have to address the capitalist structure that feeds all of this.
I have to mention this because this is something that when we first started discussing, I figured I would mention it. And this could be a good close. It's essentially just a way of looking out at the world. And this was mentioned in a book I recently read. It was called Marxian versus Neoclassical Economics by Richard Wolff, who is a Marxist economist. And he basically stated the big difference between the two systems is neoclassicals, or liberals, look at the world as being basically a product of a bunch of individuals making decisions and actions. And these individuals shape the world. So if you're successful, it's because you did it. Now, in Marxian theory, it's through what's called dialectical materialism. And the best way to describe dialectical materialism is basically we have an infinite number of contradictions in the world. And these contradictions all play out And that's how the world develops, through these contradictions. And it's impossible to pinpoint any one issue that is what makes it. And basically what Marx states is all of these different things have resulted in the development of the capitalist system. But what we can do is we can turn it as the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. And we can look for solidarity among the proletariat. And that contradiction can potentially force its way through and help settle some of these other contradictions, such as the blacks versus whites, or, well, racists versus non-racists is probably a better term.
Right. Okay. No, that sounds great. I guess I'll maybe try and get you to shoot me a few reference links for show notes.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I can recommend like books, YouTube's probably better for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And some of things like that.
Yeah, I know that I'm a particularly slow reader. From our messages, I started reading The Shock Doctrine, but I'm just starting it.
It's really good. That's a book I think more people need to read.
Okay, perfect.
Oh, there's
awesome.
a documentary on YouTube of it too.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. So you can digest the majority. And actually, there's a few things that are different in the documentary, so it's good to actually watch and read both.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining me. And,
thank you.
It's been a great talk. We'll have to connect again to get a bit more info.
Sounds good. And like, I would actually love to talk about more in other issues. I mean,
for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you. All right.
Okay. So that's the end of the interview. I really liked this one. I hope you did. It's always super cool to chat with and learn from people that you've met online. And Jason is no exception. He's clearly a very smart dude and really knows his stuff when it comes to socialism and Marxism. If you have any leanings towards Marxism, then I highly recommend following his page, Dictatorship of the Swoletariat. I will put that on Facebook. I will put that in the show notes so that you can link it. Jason, last time I talked to him, was on a 30-day ban from Facebook, so you'll have to click the little thing that makes you get notifications so that you know when it's back up and running. I'll provide, like I say, a link to that page in the notes, and I'll also provide a link to his Twitter, which is @MarxistSoccer. Before I do the feedback and outro stuff, I want to apologize again to everybody for getting this out late. I would love to blame Patreon because I got locked out of my Brainstorm account, but I did leave things too long and procrastinate too much. I got in finally to my Patreon account, so everything should be working now again. I would love to be able to set something up separate from Patreon, but we don't have enough financial supporters for the show on either side of the thing, either the Hardcore Skeptic or on Brainstorm, for that to be worthwhile. Maybe in the future I'll look into setting something separate up where people can go and subscribe through that instead of subscribing through Patreon. All right, so I got a little bit of housekeeping to do. First, I gave away 2 books after the Karen Garst episode. Randy Lamonda got the copy of Conspiracies Declassified, which he said he was going to give to a conspiracy theorist friend of his, which I love. And Jesse Hoffner got the copy of Women v. Religion. I'm happy that I could help promote great books by great people, and I hope to have more interviews with authors whose books I can give away a copy of. There's something about sending books to listeners that makes me a very happy podcaster. All right, so on to feedback. There's not a ton, there's a little bit. Will Driver sent an email after the episode with Aaron Rabbi, and he says, I know you more or less changed your position on absolutism, but after listening to Rabbi's arguments, I'm still a relativist. Morals as a society change over time as society changes. Our personal morals change as we learn and grow. morals are somewhat situational too. Even after listening to the conversation, I could not grasp how one reaches moral absolutism, though I will say morality can be absolute within a constructed framework, but it is not absolute in and of itself. Meaning, if the framework changes, so do your absolutes. All of that said, I have taken 0 philosophy classes and only read about philosophy and morality casually, so I have added Rabbi's podcast to my list and look forward to reading more. And I think a lot of it comes down to what you define as objective versus subjective. Like the way that Aaron defined objective morality is morality that is external to the person. So I think that in itself is the key right there. Like, it's not as though we discovered that murder was wrong in the same way that we discovered Pluto wasn't a planet, right? Or that we discovered a new asteroid or something like that. Like, but both are external. Murder, based on the definition, is wrong because it's wrong. Because of the definition of the word murder. It is external to your subjective experience. And I think that that's part of what he means. Obviously, it's much more complex than I can say in the next 10 minutes or 5 minutes or 2 minutes, whatever I happen to ramble on for. But I find that morals seem objective in some very real ways, right? Like, I say murder is wrong. That's a fact, right? We can say that because we know the definition of murder, we can say that that is wrong based on just as a fact. We can say slavery is wrong. We can even say, based on the information that we got in the past, that slavery was always wrong. We just didn't realize it. It has objectively negative outcomes for society, for individuals, and for anyone kind of in process in slavery. Anyone who is a slave is hurt by it. Many people say that those who were slave owners were hurt by the act of slavery, of owning slaves. So in many ways, there's measurements, objective measurements, that we can look at external to our personal values that tell us if something is good or bad as a system or as an act. An act can be based on a number of different information sources that we get. And I mean, I'm rambling on here a little bit, but that's all to say that part of me says that, of course, some morals are objective. Some things are objectively morally good, and some things are objectively morally bad. And they will remain, though, good or bad, regardless of the society that we live in, or even our own personal value system, if that makes sense. That's not to say that I can prove that in some pure way. I have a nagging feeling in the back of my head that it's all still just based on the way I value things and the values of the people around me, and that we as a society have all kind of decided that these are the way we view morals. So I don't know. I haven't decided what. I'm not on either side of this yet. I may never come down one way or the other. I'm more a wishy-washy person when it comes to morality. Not in, and now I feel I have to qualify that by saying I'm not wishy-washy in the things that I consider moral. I'm wishy-washy in the idea of whether morality is objective or subjective. Okay. So in between those episodes, I got a couple emails. The Karen Garst episode came out. after the Aaron Rabbi episode, the Karen Garst episode came out, and I got a few emails about the books, even though I had already given them away. And people said some really kind things about the show. I'm not going to go through them all, but it was really nice to hear and get those messages from people. It's nice to know that people appreciate what you do. So after the Karen Garst episode, Will emailed me again. And he said, "You mentioned concern that debating people who come to talk in bad faith is not valuable. I think on one-on-one it may be pointless, but in a public venue like MythCon, I believe it could be very impactful. Take her coming debate, for example. Like it or not, atheists may have lost their faith, but many of us kept the cultural training of female oppression we were raised with. You see it all over the movement, and honestly, it should have been expected. The power of Karen's debate will not be her impact on her partner, but the impact on her partner's followers at MythCon and the internet at large. Beyond that, there will be many in the audience who think they have cleared out all the oppressive crap that religion and culture have laid on them. These people, being sensitive to their issues, already will probably find areas within themselves that they missed when cleaning out all that mess." And yeah, the point of engaging with these folks isn't really to convince them because they won't be convinced. But I'm not so sure that you can even make the smallest dent when it comes to their followers either. I'm reminded of my discussion with the YouTuber anti-feminist Morally Gray. His viewers weren't impacted by the discussion at all. They just thought that I was a dude who had been brainwashed into the cult of feminism and social justice. They didn't even give the things I said a decent critical examination. And I'm more and more worried that people simply aren't able to be reached once they've hit a certain level of dogmatism and an unwillingness to change their minds. And I think that once you follow somebody like Karen's opponent and even people like Peter Boghossian, Sargon of Akkad, and those anti-feminist types, I think that they're stuck in a way of thinking and they're not willing to change their minds. I worry that Karen is going into this debate and she's engaging with people where she will not have any impact on the way that they view things. Maybe she will, maybe she won't, maybe I'm just being cynical, but I worry that has no effect. And I worry that some of the tactics that anti-feminists use can undermine the viewpoint of feminists to people who are on the fence. Because sometimes people on the fence just need a bit more education. They just need to learn more. They need to look at feminist videos and learn what feminists are actually saying. They don't need to see a debate between somebody who's trying to convince them that women still need feminism and somebody who thinks that women should not have the right to vote. But that's me. Again, this is one of these things where we all kind of back and forth have our own opinions and disagree, and I really appreciate the emails, Will. I'm not sure if we agree or disagree, but it's good to hear from you anyway. So I have a couple of YouTube comments. On the video from a while back, we talked to Dusty Henenfent about prayer in school, which was, the case was that Dusty's kids were at a school where they were doing the Lord's Prayer in a public school. And she petitioned to get that changed and to have them stop doing that. I believe she was ultimately successful. I might have to double check with Dusty again sometime in the future here just to make sure I know the full story. But this comment was from a person named Zachary Ellis on that video. And he says, "Your kids had the right to leave the room if they didn't want to be part of the routine, and yet it wasn't good enough. The Lord's Prayer was a tradition at Lyndale for many years, and just because you didn't agree with it didn't mean you should have made a decision for all of Moose Jaw. Just my opinion. Sorry if you don't like it." And frankly, I don't like it. It's a garbage opinion. What you're talking about is discrimination against Dusty's kids because they don't follow the same religion as the majority. This is the same as discrimination against kids from any other religion and isn't okay. The point of a society isn't to enforce the will of the majority onto those who are different, but to respect and accommodate different groups of people to ensure that the people of that tradition or people within that society thrive. Forcing kids out of the classroom is discrimination. And you think it's okay because of tradition? Well, too bad. Tradition isn't good enough reason to do a thing that infringes on other people's rights. Of course, you're ignoring the fact that it wasn't just playing in the classrooms, but also in the hallway, which is how Dusty heard it. She never would have known this was going on if she hadn't heard it in the hall. And that means you're not just forcing kids to sit out in the hall while your privileged kids get to take part in the religious ceremony of their choice. That means that you also think they should be put out of the school while that's going on. Because they'd have to sit outside to not have to be subjected to your religious ceremony. And that's not okay. As for it being opinion, well, you're wrong. I mean, yeah, it's your opinion. It's a wrong fucking opinion. You don't get to pretend that the fact that you're wrong and haven't thought through this enough or haven't thought about this through any perspective except your own is okay just because it's your opinion. That's bullshit. That's a cop-out. That's saying, I know that I'm just spouting nonsense, but it's my opinion, so you don't get to criticize me. Well, fuck that, and fuck you. Sorry. You don't want to live in a society where people are treated equally. You want privilege. And that's shitty. And that's just a shitty thing to do. So, I guess that's that. On the episode with Mandisa Thomas on being a black non-believer, JC's Turn 68 said, as long as black people leave everything in God's hands, they'll always be at the bottom in America and the world. And I don't know. I can't say it any better than that. I find that I wholeheartedly agree with that. Like, I think anybody who is putting religion at the start of their life is missing out. I don't think that we'll ever reach, as society, will ever reach any equality of any kind as long as people are clinging to ancient and outdated beliefs. Now, obviously, I'm not black, so I can't speak to anything, any personal experience in that way. But it seems to me that religion has had a mixed effect on black people in the United States, and I don't know that the same positives couldn't have been done through a lens of humanism instead of religion. So with that taken care of, let's move on to Patreon. Well, we don't have any new patrons, and I want to apologize for not getting this out early to patrons. It will be out maybe 10 minutes before it goes public. But there was also a weird thing where Patreon was claiming people were declined when they shouldn't have been. And so as a result, it might be worth double checking your stuff to make sure everything's A-okay. I also want to thank our top patrons: Bassett, Destin Doesn't Suck That Much, Daryl Goosen, Aaron Young, William Driver, and Positively Skeptical. If you want a special shout out in every episode, then you can become a $5 or up patron at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast. We have no new reviews on Facebook or iTunes, but if you like what you hear, then you can help the show reach more people by reviewing us on those platforms. Plus, I'll read it on the air, which everybody likes hearing their stuff read on the air. Isn't that right? Right? Right. I was recently on an episode of Semi-Intellectual Musings as a kind of guest / guest host / co-host. I don't know. I was kind of sick, so my voice is a bit gravelly. And there was one spot where I had to take a break and like cough. But it was a lot of fun anyway. I did an awful job of promoting Brainstorm. Normally I have Twitter handles and Facebook pages and all the stuff in my head ready to go. But being sick and just coming off holidays, it wasn't there. So, there's that. But I had a bit of a back and forth with a comedian whose name is Kevin Gauthier or something like that. And we talked about PC culture and comedy and whether or not PC culture is damaging comedy. I'm sure you can tell where I fall, but I'll be putting that out as an episode of Brainstorm. I also encourage you to check it out on Semi-Intellectual Musings because they did an interview separate from the portion that I was on, and that's going to be spliced in with the segments that we talked about. Phil is an amazing editor for podcasts. He can cut things together very well and just create like a flow of an episode. It's definitely worth listening to. I will put links to that episode in the show notes, and I'll also link the Semi-Intellectual Musings Facebook page and Twitter account. For everything else, you can check out the show notes at thebrainstormpodcast.com or our website, brainstormblog.net. Thanks to our financial supporters, Bassett, Keith, Kim, Janet, Stephanie, Zach, the Utah Outcasts, Will, Aaron, Daryl, Bob Glenn, Destin Doesn't Suck That Much, Magnus, several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave, Positively Skeptical, Rob, Chris, and Larry. If you want to join them and help the show grow, then you can do that at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast. Or go buy some stuff at tpublic.com/stores/brainstorm-podcast-gear. That will be in the show notes as well. Or you can go to our brainstormblog.net and click the support button. It takes you to a place where you can buy shirts, support the show in a variety of ways. Thanks to Dave for our intro music. Thanks to Aaron Rabbi for doing the voiceover for our intro. You can find his podcast at voidpod.com. Thanks to Alex Capper Murdoch for doing the voiceover for our ads. And thanks to Jason Camo for our outro music. You can find his stuff at aloststateofmind.com. All music played is either with permission or under the SOCAN license to play. For more information on SOCAN, you can check out the music license info page on our website, brainstormblog.net. Remember to give us a rating, a thumbs up, or a fave on your podcatcher of choice. Join our Facebook group, like our page, follow us on Twitter, share the show, and spread the word. Thanks for listening, and remember, the truth matters.
This is an opinion-based podcast. Each person on the podcast is responsible for their own opinions, and those opinions don't necessarily reflect the views of the rest of the panel. Any guests or anyone associated with the people on the podcast, such as spouses, partners, children, other family members, friends, or employers. No one person speaks for the podcast with the possible exception of Cory, and he doesn't speak for anyone else on the show. The Brainstorm podcast does not represent the views of our sponsors.
Maybe he's trolling, but we don't know. But at the same time, it's not really a good troll because all he did was make a bunch of people think he's a complete idiot. But then there's also do you know who Slavoj Zizek is?
Yeah, actually, I haven't paid any attention to him before, but I've recently seen his name coming up a few times.
Slavoj Zizek has a term called liberal communist, which a liberal communist is essentially like a billionaire philanthropist, like Bill Gates.
Oh, okay.
So he donates a ton of money to charity. He builds up this reputation of being someone that cares for the poor and cares for making. And Elon Musk fits that to a T.
Right.
And I think that's what he actually thinks being a socialist is. And it just isn't.
Right. Yeah, jeez.
Yeah, it's...
Yeah, I don't know. It's been an interesting couple days watching people just tear Elon Musk apart. It's ridiculous.
Well, frankly, he deserves it. I mean, he's getting less than I would prefer.
Right? Yeah.
I'll try not to go too tanky on you at times, but sometimes it needs to be said.
No, that sounds good.
Yeah. You do know where the term tanky comes from, right?
I don't actually know the origin or anything. I have heard it more and more, but
it's completely misused. But like the word tanky comes from apologists to when Nikita Khrushchev was into Hungary to suppress the revolt. The British communists that agreed with Khrushchev doing that were termed tankies. Now it's essentially just anyone that says something somewhat radical beyond where it's like, well, it's one thing to say it's like the workers own the means of production. It's another thing to say that we should beat the shit out of the capitalists. It's like, you're a tanky. It's like, well...
That's not quite right, is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. It also... I mean, most people actually associate it with Stalin, which is historically inaccurate, but that's what they say is because Stalin was actually dead by the time that happened.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, and we'll try not to get into too much like Soviet history because people probably don't care.
Yeah, probably not. Well, I guess, yeah, I mean, I guess I'll hit the record button here and then we can kind of just...
Well, one thing we should add, because I just thought about it, and I just read a book by Naomi Klein.
Okay.
The Puerto Rico situation.
Oh, yeah, I saw you posted that.
Yeah, we absolutely should talk about that because that ties into Marxist theory and more so Lenin's theory of imperialism, because that's exactly what's happening in Puerto Rico and has been happening pretty much since it became a colony.
Right, right. Okay, I'll write that down so that we don't forget it.
All right. Bring on the guillotines.
All right. All right, I'm going to hit this button.
All right, cool.
Portugal. So, what, or no, that's not right, is it?
No, that's why I said that.
Puerto Rico,
yes. Yeah, Portugal. I mean, Portugal has some cool things going on with their like drug policies and stuff like that, but I don't really think of them as a socialist bastion. I mean, they did have a revolution that was led by socialists that freed them of a fascist dictatorship a long time ago.
Actually, in the most recent episode of Brainstorm, we just talked about Portugal legalizing drugs, which is probably why that's on my head.
Yes, and that's actually I'm a big supporter of that as well. I mean, that's the policy that all countries should look at because it works.
Right.
But nobody likes these things like facts and evidence. They like their conspiracy theories and preconceived biases.
Everybody's afraid, runs on fear, basically.
Yes.
Okay, so not Portugal, but